Today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt begins a new series in 1 Corinthians.
An idol is what God calls anything that we place in our hearts or in our minds as being more desirable than Him. So, the ancient world dominated by idols, similar to our culture today. They made them into statues. We build colosseums. It's all the same.
Ancient conflicts revealed timeless truths about Christian unity. And today, on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt uncovers surprising parallels between the Corinthian church's struggles and our own struggles today. We're diving into 1 Corinthians chapter 8 to discover how to navigate disagreements with love and wisdom. It's a challenging lesson titled, Love Always Goes Well with Steak, from the Unity First series, a study in the book of 1 Corinthians. This series is available online at thejourney.fm. And now, here's Pastor Steve DeWitt to get us started.
We are beginning now another controversy that was going on in the church at Corinth. Remember that Paul is writing this letter in response to a letter that the Corinthians wrote him where they had all of these questions. We saw in chapter 7, verse 1, that he just says, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote." And he begins chapter 8 essentially the same way, now though dealing with another struggle. What we have seen though, as we've talked about these, is that the struggles that the early church had are essentially the same struggles that the contemporary church had. Now, the actual issue might be slightly different, but the underlying problems are the same because the human heart is the same. We are the same as them, and the problems that the church and God's people will deal with will always be essentially the same. So now here we get on to another controversy, and here was the problem. In the church at Corinth, there were Christians who were disagreeing. Yeah. Christians were disagreeing. What was happening was there were Christians that had issues that they did not agree on, and these disagreements turned into arguments, and the arguments turned into rancor and division, and there were all kinds of problems that came from it. I just have to say that I take some comfort in reading the early church and seeing churches that were pastored by the apostles and early church heroes and seeing in those churches problems. I love that. It's very comforting for me and church leaders here at Bethel because we are... Why do we have problems in a church? Let's just make sure that we all understand it. Because the church is not a building, the church is people. And whenever you have people involved in anything, you have problems. And so that is why the early church had problems. That is why we have problems, because we're a part of it. And okay, moving on. So you see, this is now where we're going, and this has always been the case in the church. Now, part of the reason that there are disagreements in any church is that there are so many potential things that we can disagree on. We have all kinds of areas that we potentially could have different opinions on. You think about matters of faith and doctrine, and then you get to maybe secondary sort of theological issues, and then there are matters of worldview and politics and marriage and parenting and lifestyle decisions and Christian liberty issues, and on and on and on you can go with all of these things that we potentially could disagree on. In fact, we oftentimes do. You get 3 Christians together, there are 4 opinions on anything, right? And there were disagreements at the church at Corinth. Now, before we get into the text, I want to say something else to you today, and that is that I know we have many people who coming to Bethel is a tipping of your toes in the water of Christianity again, because you in your past have had some experience with church or with Christians that has been ugly, and you have seen Christians get ugly. And the fruit of that is that you have said, I don't want to have any part of that. And there are people that have Christian experiences in their background, and they say, I am never going to a church again. And we have people here all the time who are deciding maybe just to sort of crack the door and to give it one more try. And I would bet in your past, the thing that turned you off at whatever that was that happened, it was not probably the doctrine of the church. It probably was not the ministry philosophy of the church or the strategy of the church. The thing that turned you off were the attitudes in the church. Hypocrisy, haughty, sort of know-it-all, we got it all figured out, looking down on people that perhaps disagree in some particular way, and thousands of people never go to church again because of that. And so if you are here today and that is you, and this in some way is maybe you just cracking the door of your heart again to the claims of Christianity and to the possibility that there might be something that is different than what you've experienced in the past, I hope that today's message explains in some way why that happened in the past and might give you a little bit of hope that there might be something real that you have yet to experience. That'd be a great fruit of this message. So with that, let's get into 1 Corinthians 8, and I'll just tell you on the front end that there are cultural barriers that we have to cross to understand what they're talking about here, because the issue in the church at Corinth this is not an issue that we deal with today. And maybe that's a helpful thing, actually, because there's nobody disagreeing today with what this chapter is about. And I'm glad for that, because if I was to say, okay, well, let me just give you some examples of things that we disagree with, and I sort of said some of those, automatically we'd have people going, well, I already know what I think about that. I don't need to listen to this anymore. Or the people that don't agree with me on this one, they're bad people, or something like that. But this is an issue that none of us are struggling with. So we're just sort of free to talk about it and have a paradigm for how to approach the things that we do disagree with. Okay, so I'm going to read 1 Corinthians 8, the entire chapter. It's only 13 verses. We're really going to study verses 1 through 6 today. Now concerning food offered to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he does not know yet as he ought to know. But if anyone loves God, he is known by God. Therefore, as to the eating of food offered to idols, we know that an idol has no real existence, and that there is no God but one. For although there may be so-called gods in heaven and on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things and for whom we exist, and one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. However, not all possess this knowledge. But some, through former association with idols, eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We are no worse off if we do not eat, and no better off if we do. But take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, will he not be encouraged, if his conscience is weak, to eat food offered to idols? And so by your knowledge, this weak person is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. Thus, sinning against your brother and wounding their conscience when it is weak, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if food makes my brother stumble, I will never eat meat, lest I make my brother stumble. All right, so we're going to focus in today on verses 1 through 6, but I want you to realize that this is a big issue. Notice that he doesn't stop at the end of chapter 8. He continues into chapter 9, talking about how he, even as an apostle, surrenders rights that he has for the good of God's people. It goes on into chapter 10, all the way to the beginning of chapter 11. 64 verses in 1 Corinthians deal with how Christians should live in community with one another. So this is something that was very important to the Apostle Paul, I think should be as well to us. All right, now let's talk about idols and idolatry. Here is kind of somewhat of a cultural barrier that we need to understand if we're going to get what he is talking about here. In the ancient world, it's hard for us to realize how in the ancient world, idols and idol worship was so dominant. It was such a central part of everyday life. For us, we think about a polytheistic worldview. We don't run across it that much in our day-to-day life. In America, Hinduism is a polytheistic religion. So if you have maybe Hindu neighbors or something like that, you might run across that. New Agers would be that, but that's a pretty small percentage in America. The American religions are predominantly monotheistic. Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are monotheistic religions. Atheism and agnosticism are not monotheistic, but they're also not polytheistic. So it's not very often that the average American is going to run into somebody who explains reality with a pantheon of gods who are sort of controlling everything that goes on. But that was the world of the first century. That was really the ancient world. Ancient world history, the predominant religion was polytheism, and they believed that there were gods that were behind everything. And so they explained reality with their gods. If you read biblical history, what you come across all the time is God's people, Old Testament Israel, Judaism, New Testament Christianity, both monotheistic religions, trying to survive in a passionately polytheistic world. And this created all kinds of problems. Think, for example, of Israel. Israel is let out of slavery by God. They have this incredible miracle where God dries the Red Sea. They walk across on dry land. They get to the other side. They go to Mount Sinai. Moses goes to the top of the mountain. Days after walking across a body of water on dry land and seeing all that happened, Aaron makes a golden calf and says, Israel, listen, this is the God that brought you out of Egypt. And here you have Israelites who have seen this miracle, know the God of Israel, and right away they're like, okay, we bow down to the golden calf. In America, we sort of look at that and go, who would do that? What sane person would bow down to a statue? Well, today there are 1 billion Hindus in India, 1/6 the world's population, that bows down to idols in a polytheistic religion. Hundreds of millions of others down through history have done it, and they were the same as us. So from the perspective of their worldview, and that's where we have to sort of cross the cultural barrier here, from the perspective of their worldview, it was entirely rational to explain things that were happening as gods that were making them happen. So, for example, yesterday morning, when the storm came rolling through, and you heard the thunder and all of that, you thought to yourself, oh, we have here now meteorological forces that are causing electricity to be between the clouds and the earth, and the lightning is creating a sound wave that comes to us in a sound. But you know what? In the ancient world, they would have said, Zeus is waking up. Or they go to the ocean and they see the waves coming in and the tides going in and back and all of that, and they go, Poseidon is doing it. Nobody thought anything of that. That was their explanation of reality. The ancient world was filled with gods and myths and stories, and these stories were the ancient world's explanation of reality, and they kept people, all these people just like us, down through history, filled with fear and wondering what the gods were going to do next. So their gods were their explanation for reality, and I just want you to realize, before we look at those people and go, freaks, we are the same. Our culture strives to explain reality by having the idols of our day. The gods of the Romans and the Greeks were pretty much all about power, sex, money, prosperity, beauty. What is different is that they created physical manifestations of them and places to go where they could worship them. But I would say to you that we are essentially the same in our culture. I mean, imagine if we got on a plane, all of us get in a plane, and we just do a flyby of the city of Chicago. What would stand out in a flyby of the city of Chicago? Well, we would see Soldier Field, Merchandise Mart, United Center, Navy Pier. What's a big deal in Chicago? Sport, money, art, pleasure. Our gods are the same. We are the same as them. Now, what is an idol? Let's talk about specifically what is an idol. An idol is what God calls anything that we place in our hearts or in our minds as being more desirable than Him. So don't think of an idol specifically as a little statue that somebody has made. An idol is anything that I value in my priority list, in my worship list, in my desire list, as being more valuable, desirable, what I really want in my life, more than God. Now, this is what we call an idol. This is what God calls an idol. The Corinthians didn't call these idols. They were gods. So they didn't say, hey, let's go down and worship the idols. They said, we're going to go down and we're going to worship the gods. They were gods to them. For a god to become an idol, it has to be placed ahead of something that it shouldn't be placed ahead of. The only way you have an idol is if there is one God and something is being placed where it shouldn't be. I got thinking about the cultural phenomenon, American Idol. I think this actually is helpful in understanding what an idol is. Are you familiar with the show? American Idol, if you don't know, this is how it works. It starts with like tens of thousands of people, and they sing, and they whittle them down, right? They put some people ahead of others in the competition. So you end up then with like the top 100, and then you have the top 25, and then you have the top 10, and finally you have the top 2. But you still don't have an American Idol, because you have to have an American Idol, you have to have one thing that is put in front of everything else. And finally, when they decide who that is, that person, he or she, is now the American Idol. She or he is the one who is put ahead of all the rest. An idol is what God calls anything that we put ahead of Him. And this is why the first commandment is not, don't have adultery, don't murder, don't lie, don't covet. The very first commandment is foundational to all of the other obedience measures. Here it is. You shall have no other gods put ahead of me. Now here's how our doctrinal statement here at Bethel Church says it. The triune God is perfect, beautiful, and glorious in all His attributes. These attributes include, but are not limited to, holiness, sovereignty, power, justice, wisdom, truth, faithfulness, mercy, goodness, and love. God's infinite worth demands that mankind ascribe ultimate glory to Him, and His immeasurable value means that nothing should be honored or treasured more than God Himself. Did we get it right? I think so. No idols, no other gods. Nothing is more valuable than Him. So, the ancient world dominated by idols, similar to our culture today. They made them into statues. We build colosseums. It's all the same. Now, let's talk about the issue related to 1 Corinthians 8. And this has to do with this whole meat offered to idols and idol feasts. So here's what's going on in Corinth. The center of, and we got a little history here, but hang with me, the center of the hub of everything in Corinth was the temple of Aphrodite. Sat on the hill. This was the focus of the city. This is where everybody went. This was the hubbub of everything. And so the way that they worshiped Aphrodite is that part of how they did it, they would take a sacrifice to the temple. They would bring an animal as a sacrifice to Aphrodite, and the priest at the temple would divide the meat of that sacrifice into 3 parts. One was burned, one went to the priest, and one went back to the person who brought it in the first place. So, what happened then was that with all of these sacrifices being offered in a mega city like Corinth, I mean, how much meat can a priest eat in a day? I mean, if I eat like a 12-ounce steak for me, I'm pretty good to go. Although I wouldn't mind trying to eat 2 sometime. If you wanted to take me out, I would be happy to give it a go. But that's pretty much enough for me. So a priest then is getting all of this meat, tons of meat. And so what they would do is they would sell it in the marketplace. And So this is meat that had been offered at the temple, but now has made its way to the marketplace. So when you went to buy meat, you didn't know necessarily if this was meat that had previously been offered at the temple, but now is being sold in the grocery store or not. And so you couldn't know. There was no like freezer sections, idle free, meat or something like that. That just was all just meat. So the Christians get talking, and one of them says, you know what, I'm not so sure. I think it's a good idea that Christians ought to eat meat that's been offered to the goddess Aphrodite. And another person goes, well, I ain't really thought about that, but I think that's a very good point. And somebody else goes, you guys don't know what you're talking about. Oh, yeah? Yeah. And then you have the classic church disagreement. And you see how this went. You had some people that thought it was okay to eat that meat, others that were like still had some superstition about the whole idol thing and the goddess and all of that, and they didn't feel like it was an okay thing to do. The other part of the controversy had to do with these meals or feasts that were at the temple. Apparently part of the temple there was almost like a banquet area where they would oftentimes have just Corinthian social kind of dinners, but it was at the temple, okay? So was it okay for Christians to go and to eat at the temple, even if they're not there to worship the goddess Aphrodite? And so you can see how this went. Well, one Christian goes, you know what? I used to go here and I used to worship the goddess Aphrodite. And now that I'm a Christian, I just don't feel right about that so much anymore. And somebody else goes, well, it doesn't bother me at all, and I like the food there. It's good. I love the food at that place. And the other person, well, you know what? I feel a little offended that you feel that way. And the other person, well, I feel a little offended that you feel that way. And so there you go. So off you go with this disagreement. And so here now is the issue. Are you with me? Do you understand how this could work? If you've been in the church very long, it's not hard to imagine how you could get groups of people going, you're bad, no, you're stupid, and all this goes on. So Paul steps in now with apostolic correction to what is happening. It's verse 1. Now concerning food offered to idols, we know that, quote, all of us possess knowledge. This knowledge puffs up, but love builds up.
A reminder from Pastor Steve DeWitt that knowledge without love can create division, but love with knowledge strengthens the community. You're listening to The Journey and a message titled, Love Always Goes Well with Steak. To replay this message, visit thejourney.fm or subscribe to The Journey podcast. Just search your favorite podcast platform for The Journey with Pastor Steve DeWitt. Well, thanks for being with us on The Journey today. Right now, I'm excited to share an opportunity that could transform your prayer life and impact our nation. It's a resource that helps you lift up our country to God titled, If My People, A Prayer Guide for Our Nation by Jack Countryman. This isn't just another book. It's a 40-day journey inspired by 2 Chronicles 7:14, designed to help us humble ourselves, seek God's face, and pray for our land. In this time of national division, If My People reminds us where our true hope lies. Each day you'll find thought-provoking reflections, relevant scripture readings, and guided prayers for our nation. But that's not all. This hardcover edition also features 7 powerful prayers from past presidents, offered during some of our country's darkest hours. It's a tangible reminder that in God we still trust. Here at The Journey, we believe in the power of prayer to change hearts and heal our land. That's why we're making If My People available to you with your gift of any amount. Your support not only keeps our broadcast on the air, but also places this powerful prayer tool in your hands. Whether you use it personally, with your family, or in your church group, If My People will inspire you to make a difference through prayer as we approach this important election. Are you ready to embark on this 40-day prayer journey for our nation? Call 844-7-JOURNEY. That's 844-756-8763. Or give online at thejourney.fm. I'm Tim Svoboda. Come back tomorrow when we continue this lesson from 1 Corinthians. We're learning more about putting unity first in our walk of faith. That's Friday on The Journey. Today's program was produced and furnished by Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana.